Welcome to Roundabout Oxford, a podcast from the University of Mississippi Libraries.
Welcome to another episode of Roundabout Oxford. My name is Taylor Fields. Today, the team sits down with two professors from the university, poet and novelist Melissa Ginsberg and president of Delta Windbirds Jason Hoeksema, to discuss their love for nature and how they express it.
Hi, this is Abbie Norris, the Digital Initiatives Librarian with Roundabout Oxford, and I am here interviewing Melissa Ginsberg. Melissa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Melissa Ginsberg. I'm a poet and novelist, and I teach in the English department at the University of Mississippi. I teach creative writing and literature.
Thank you. And Melissa is here today to do a reading of one of her poems.
This poem is called Year of Mockingbirds. The plague year, the Lord sent the mockingbird nests. They surrounded the house, twigs, a loose braid, a mimicry, a tangle. The Lord gave the birds unto the ersatz house, mocked the face-high boughs, weighed down with nests. The Lord hung copies, hung counterfeits in every line of sight. The ersatz Lord derided, nests inched closer to my hunger. The borrowed twigs appeared in my clutching beak, and the Lord, the simulated Lord, saw fit to repeat another's rough song. The Lord has seen before this speckled orb this year. The Lord has mocked, has envied and spied, has burlesqued and lined with fine material this moss and grass, has hung swiftly netted promises, taunted cries from boughs, has scoffed, has stolen every song there was.
Thank you. So to start, I would love to hear more about that poem and where your inspiration came from.
Yeah, well, I wrote this poem last spring, so it was the beginning of quarantine, and it's also, this is the time of year that mockingbirds are building nests, and for the first time since I've been living in my house, so I've been there 10 years, but for some reason last year, I saw a ton of mockingbird nests just right around the house. They'd never nested that close before, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because I was home all the time and watching more closely, but so then I started doing some research about mockingbirds, and that research, I do a lot of research for my poems, and that research informed some of the vocabulary of this poem and some of the repetition. Mockingbirds build, the male mockingbird builds a lot of nests and lets the female choose which one she likes. So he builds the outside, and then she will choose the best one and bring all of the soft material to line the inside. And so a lot of these nests didn't have birds in them. They were just, like quickly put together. There's sort of large, messy nests. They're not like very architecturally interesting. They just look like they look like a tangle of branches, of little twigs, So I was also, like this is a part of a series of poems that I wrote around the same time that are more or less about the pandemic and capturing this sort of unsettling, fearful time at the beginning before we knew how bad it was going to be, or what it, when we were like wiping down all of our groceries with sanitary, wipes, and just terrified of everything. So I think it's responding to that whole mood too.
With doing research for your poems, I know that every poem is different, but do you find that when you get an idea, it's centered around a theme or a word or even form? How do you feel like your poems usually start?
They usually start with a line, which sometimes doesn't even make a lot of sense to me, but is musically interesting. And then I'll just work with it and build on it. Sometimes a word will occur to me, and I'm interested in etymology. I'm interested in vocabulary, and like the sort of secret hidden lives of words that we don't think about when we use them all the time. And so I look up synonyms a lot. I look up etymology a lot. And there's so much information that is just already present in like behind the surface of the language that we use every day. And I get really interested in that and inspired by that and follow that up. So a lot of my poems just start with music and proceed through a kind of, following vocabulary to its roots and then back out.
That's so interesting that you mentioned music because I write more fiction, but when I took a poetry class, and when I do write poetry, I come from a musical background, and I think the reason I love poetry so much is because I like trying to fit it into a musical structure. So do you have a musical background as well?
I do not, no,
Okay.
Not at all. I'm not a musician. But the thing that I love about poetry more than content, more than meaning is just the sound of poetry. And when I read poetry, I read it just sort of stunned by the musicality of it. And I just let the sounds wash over me. And it's not till a second reading that I start to think, like, what is this actually talking about? It's so secondary for me as a reader and as a writer.
And so with that and with the sound of poetry, I've noticed that many of your poems are more experimental in form. They're not just, what you typically would think of when you think of a poem. So how do sound and form affect one another when it comes to your poetry?
Well, I think that the form, like the way the poems look on the page, I do have a visual arts background, and so I'm really interested in sort of poems as like visual compositions, as landscapes sometimes, and I'm really interested in what white space does in between the words on a page. So that is always something I think a lot about. The placement on the page is really deliberate in my poems. And it also affects rhythm. So if you have a lot of white space, then there's going to be more of a pause there when you read it, even when you're reading it silently to yourself. So yeah, that is a tool that I employ a lot and that I'm always aware of. Another project that is really central to my work is just the idea of saying something in a new way in order to allow the reader to experience something in language for the first time. So there's a kind of energy and excitement to discovering anything that you haven't seen before. And I want to create that freshness as often as possible in my poetry, because I just want that sort of initial shock to be a part of the experience. So playing around with form and playing around with vocabulary is part of, like, those are some of the tools I use in order to make language that we use all the time stranger, in order to talk about something that is not an everyday thing to talk about. I hate to explain things in poems. There are poets who do that really well, but when I try to do it, I think I always just sound so boring and I get frustrated, So I try to just build something that's entirely new. instead of using representational language.
And obviously, Year of Mockingbirds focuses on nature as a central theme. Do you often write about nature?
Yeah, I do. I write from observation. I spend a lot of time outside. I garden, I keep chickens. I live on a little bit of land outside of town. And like, I'm interested in the sort of violence that occurs every day in nature. Like, there's always things dying and being killed and being like taken apart, dismantled. And we think of nature, I think, as sort of peaceful, but it's really not. And I also always have at the front of my mind ecological concerns too. So there's the violence that humans do to nature, and then there's the violence of nature itself, and those things are endlessly compelling to me. I think I will always write about those subjects and be drawn to those kinds of images.
And I guess both with nature as a place, but then also thinking about place in terms of where you live, Oxford, Mississippi, for instance. Do you feel like place has an influence on your writing?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I write so much about landscape and the place that I'm in. So my first book, Dear Weather Ghost, was written when I was living in Iowa, and that book is almost exclusively about winter. And here, like, I have a pond on my property, and I write a lot of poems that are that have a pond in them, or that think about ponds and how they work, the different layers of water in a pond, and the animals that occupy a pond or visit a pond. So yeah, I would say landscape and, like, Mississippi, northern Mississippi is a huge part of my poems. But it's on such a micro scale. Like, I'm not writing about North Mississippi Hill Country. I'm writing about this, like this 1 acre that I study constantly, So I don't know if it would be super recognizable, as like a representative Mississippi landscape poetry.
And then I would love to hear more about how you got started as a poet.
Yeah, well, I kind of discovered poetry in college when I took a class. I had always wanted to be a writer and an artist, and I was working with collage and painting and a lot of constructed surfaces that I was painting and drawing on that also incorporated text. And I was much more interested in the text than I was in the visual elements. But when I took a poetry class in college, I thought, oh, this is the thing I've been doing all along. This is the way my brain works. This is my thing, So as soon as I recognized poetry and started reading a lot more of it, I just kind of abandoned all other forms of art for many, many years. And just followed that. It felt like just a natural form of speech and thought to me. And I was relieved to find that it existed outside of my mind.
I'd love to hear more about, I guess, day-to-day life as a professor and a writer. How do you balance, teaching versus creative work? And how does working with students influence what you do creatively, if at all?
Yeah, it influences it quite a lot. I get to teach both fiction and poetry, and I get to teach graduate and undergraduate students. And then in my lit classes, I teach work that I love to read, and so it is a great pleasure to work with talented students, and there's so many great students here who are making excellent work. That is inspiring to me, and when I'm teaching poetry classes, especially at the graduate level, I write more poems and I write better poems during the semester, because there's just a kind of an immersion that happens, and I never have to leave that world or that way of thinking. So, and then like, it's also just a delight to watch students produce this beautiful work. Like, that's just exciting to be around. I love to be around that creative energy. I will say, like, writing fiction is a little different because for me, it doesn't come as naturally to me, and it requires a lot more time, and anything that takes me out of the world of the book that I'm working on is quite jarring, and then it takes some effort to get back into it. So I don't write as much fiction during the semester while I'm teaching, but I love to see my students work and to read that really closely. Like, it's just a pleasure. So yeah, I depend on summers and winter breaks to produce like large amounts of prose. But poems I can write more fluently, more easily.
The last question I have for you is, I would love to hear about other poets or authors who are inspiring you right now.
Yeah, I love the poet Shane McCrae. His work is so beautiful, every single one of his books. The other poet that I love and always teach is D.A. Powell. They both do some like semi-experimental, but also very accessible work. And a lot of it is coming out of form. They've both worked extensively with sort of deconstructed sonnets. And so Shane McCrae writes a lot about race, and his lyrics are just like stunning. They're so moving. And D.A. Powell's great subject is the AIDS pandemic. And he's a San Francisco poet and a very funny poet, very musical poet. Yeah, so I love those two. The new book that I'm most excited about recently is called Red Mouth by Claire Walmanholm. It's another book that is very musical, very dark. It's a book of grief, essentially, and it's got some erasures in it where she takes like Virgil's eclogues and pulls smaller poems out of them, and it's just really well done. I have a novel that just came out a month ago, and it's called The House Uptown, and it's set in New Orleans. It's a kind of a crime novel, but it's a sort of lyric meditation on grief and family, also. So.
Well, it's been so wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. This is lovely.
This is Alex Watson, a research librarian and associate professor at the University of Mississippi Libraries. And joining me today is...
I'm Jason Hoeksema. I'm a professor of biology here at the University of Mississippi.
And in addition to being a professor of biology, you wear another hat in the local birding community as one of its most active members. Is that right?
Yeah, that's probably correct. I lead local field trips pretty often, and I also am the president of a nonprofit organization, Delta Windbirds, whose mission is to get people outside appreciating and learning about birds. So I lead trips through that organization also.
Tell us a little bit about the trips that you lead, both through your organization and just on your own.
Mm-hmm. Well, some of it is informal. Among Oxford residents, there are quite a few people that I know of who are interested in birds and birding. And so once in a while, we will just informally announce that we're heading out to a local spot, and anyone who wants to come along is welcome to. And those are pretty impromptu local trips. I also organize the Christmas bird counts, a couple of them in the area. There's one that takes place every December near Sardis Lake, and then another one down in Grenada. And those are always field trip opportunities for anyone who wants to join. And we also lead field trips out a bit further afield. So sometimes out into the Delta, for Delta windbirds, we annually lead a Delta winter birding trip that usually focuses on Panola County, looking for big flocks of geese and wintering hawks and waterfowl and other cool winter bird specialties of the area. In the spring, we lead birding trips to look for migratory birds that are songbirds that are coming through our area, like warblers and vireos. And often for those, some of the best places are very local here. So we like to go up to Waldoxie State Park. And I know there's a field trip being led up there this weekend by members of the Memphis chapter of the Tennessee Ornithological Society. And then we'd love to go to Roanoke, one of the best places for looking for migratory birds in the spring in the whole area here is Roanoke, right on our campus.
So let's say that someone is interested in doing a little bit of introductory birding around campus. You mentioned Roanoke. Can you mention any other spots around town or on campus that are good places for someone who's just getting into the hobby to go and bird?
Yeah, so Roanoke and Bailey's Woods, I should just say a bit more about that, are really good for anyone who's interested in birds because it's just a really pleasant place to walk around. So you can park over, at the entrance to the estate there and walk the grounds of the estate around the house. And there's all kinds of ornamental shrubs and trees and flowering plants that attract a lot of birds, and it's very open. And starting in especially the next week or two, a lot of beautiful migratory songbirds start coming through and using that area. But they also tend to move around into Bailey's Woods. And so there's a very nice trail between Roanoke and the University Museum that's less than a mile, and just walking that trail can be a really nice way to see birds as well. And the creek bottom area around the bridge on that trail can be really good, especially in the warmer times of day or later in the morning. Birds often will move from the Roanoke property down into the lower, more cooler areas of the property on Bailey's Woods. So that's always recommended. But I should say that, the more we go into spring, the trees start leafing out and all the little birds start getting harder and harder to see. It also, for especially beginning birders, it's really good to get out to places where you can see larger birds in open areas. And another place right in town that's really good for that is Lamar Park. Lamar Park used to be a golf course, so it's quite open. There's a lot of grass, but there's also a lot of good habitat for birds there. A lot of old pine trees in the middle that have nesting brown-headed nuthatches. There's a lot of bird houses. They're bluebird houses that are used by not only eastern bluebirds, but also the brown-headed nuthatches themselves and some other birds like tree swallows. And all around the edges of Lamar Park are wonderful native forests. There's sort of swampy areas and more upland areas. So if you walk the perimeter of that, of the park, you can be right up against those woods. And then there's a big pond there, of course, as well. And that attracts a lot of water-loving birds. So, and it's very open there. A lot of the birds are much easier to see. So I really like taking students and other beginning birders to Lamar Park. It's always recommended, and it's really good during the spring migration as well. And then a little bit further is the Sardis Dam area. Sardis Dam and especially down below at the spillway that comes out of the dam and into Lower Lake. That area can be really fun as well. And there are a lot of birds there that are quite easy to see. There are often flocks of American white pelicans there, which are really fun to see up close. A lot of gulls hang out in that area and terns, and there's often a belted kingfisher there and various kinds of herons and egrets and waterfowl and grebes and cormorants. It's a really fun place to see water-loving birds. And they're out in the open, and so you don't have to, try to hunt through the dense leaves of the trees to see the birds that are there. And then just around the corner from Lower Lake is a beautiful spot that a lot of Oxford residents don't know about, called Clear Springs Nature Trail. And if you Google that, you can find directions. But if you drive around Lower Lake and down from the dam and around Lower Lake, it's just kind of on the way to the town of Sardis. So as you're leaving Sardis Lower Lake towards the town of Sardis, you'll see a sign on the left, and you just drive down a little ways, and there's a nice parking area and then a beautiful little boardwalk that goes out into a swamp. And in that swamp, you can see in the winter, there are sparrows, and there are always lots of woodpeckers there. But in the spring, it becomes a great place to see some of our nesting swamp birds, like prothonotary warblers and yellow-throated warblers and common yellowthroat. Blue-gray gnatcatchers nest there, and the boardwalk takes you through the swamp, and it's beautiful out there. And then it puts you back towards the road, and you can then continue across the road on a little loop trail that goes up through the woods, and you get a different habitat there, and you can see some of the birds and plants and mushrooms and everything that's happening in that upland forest habitat. And it completes a nice loop trail that's less than a mile long and very pleasant, and always a nice surprise for people who live around here who haven't seen it before.
So if someone is interested in recording a bird that they saw for posterity, how do you recommend that people make a record of what they've been able to see so that data is available to folks?
Well, that's a good question. One of the best ways to make a record of your sightings is using the online database called eBird. And there's a website, ebird.org, and you can go there and read all about that. There's a tutorial you can take about how to use eBird that makes it really easy to use. There's also an app that you can download and put on your phone that is free, and that app allows you to enter sightings while you're seeing birds. So if you know what you're seeing, you can enter the birds there. It has a curated list of likely species on the app. So when you tell it where you are, it knows what birds are most likely at that time of year and gives you a list of those to choose from. So that's a really good way to enter your sightings. And then it doubles as a personal record. It has a really nice feature for keeping track of all of your sightings, everywhere you've ever been, who you were with, if you put that in there, the birds you saw. And I really love having that record. At some point when eBird became available, I went back and put in all of my old sightings from all my notebooks from when I was a teenager and older. And now I look back on there to remind myself where I saw a certain bird for the first time, and what year was it that I went to that one place. And it's a great tool for keeping track as well. And so I highly recommend that. You can also report your sightings on the Mississippi Birding Facebook page, which is maintained by the Mississippi Ornithological Society. And that Facebook page is really good for exchanging, photos and sightings and hearing and learning about what other people are finding as well. Yeah, that Facebook page is a good place to meet people and to hear about field trips, and it's an exchange of information of all kinds related to birds. I also recommend exploring potentially joining the Mississippi Ornithological Society, the MOS. That sounds fancy, but it really is just a group that is designed to connect bird lovers and people who are interested in birds from across the state. There aren't local Audubon clubs in every town or every community in our state, and MOS performs the function of kind of a statewide club for anyone interested in birds. And we have meetings twice a year that involve field trips and a speaker. And we're going to have the spring meeting coming up in April this year on the weekend of April 24th. We'll have a virtual speaker, a woman named Jenny Duberstein, who will be coming to us by Zoom from Tucson, Arizona. She's a bird conservation expert with a fantastic career in bird conservation. And then we'll have optional in-person field trips on the coast. And you can also participate in the meeting virtually and keep track of what's going on by text messages and then come to the virtual talk in the evening. So that's another way to be connected with the birding community.
And that is missbird, missbird.org, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, wonderful. So why is it, just in your opinion, that this is something that is important, in addition to the aesthetic appreciation of birds and watching them cavort and caper and tweet? Why is birding an important hobby to engage in?
Well, aesthetic appreciation is part of it, for sure. I mean, birds are just beautiful and fascinating to watch their behavior. Their migration is one of the great spectacles of nature. Bird migration, the thousands of miles that they travel each year, and then returning to our neighborhood in sometimes the same trees year after year. It's just amazing that they can do that. And I think it gives us an appreciation for the complexity of biodiversity, to understand that and to be able to watch the cycle of bird migration is a great way to be in touch with nature. Once you start paying attention to the birds that are around you and the species that are here, some of which are here all the time, year round, some of which are here only in the winter, some of which are here only in the summer for nesting, some of which are only here during spring and fall migration. And once you start to see those patterns, it really is a fun way to watch the annual cycle of nature around you. And it gives you really something fun to look forward to at every season of the year outdoors, because it's always changing, and you can be watching out for the next birds to be coming through and arriving and departing, and it's a lot of fun for that reason. The other thing I would say is that birds are connected to the ecosystems around them, and if birds are healthy and doing well, then that's an indicator that the ecosystems they depend on are healthy and doing well. And if birds are suffering, birds are dying, or they're in trouble, that's an indicator of not just a problem with bird populations, but a problem that's much broader and deeper, and a problem with the ecosystems that they depend on and that we depend on. And so if birds are healthy and doing well, then our world is healthy and doing well. And so paying attention to the birds, not only just identifying them and making a list, but paying attention to their behavior, to their population sizes, to how things change from year to year, and to their interactions with nature, to the plants that they use, to the insects that they eat, or the other food sources that they have, is a way of paying attention to the health of the ecosystems around you. And it's a way of watching out for potential problems before they get worse. So it's a healthy way to understand the world around you. And from a very different angle, something that's become clear to me during the pandemic is that birding and getting out in nature can be just really healthy mentally. It can be a way to just disconnect from our world, from our busy lives, and breathe and appreciate something else besides what's in our houses and our right around us and our jobs, but to get out in nature and appreciate birds. It's a great mental break and a way to see the world in a different way that just refreshes you. And more than ever, we've needed that during the last year. And it's going to be a great way for, I think, a lot of people to continue to be healthy mentally and emotionally, is to go birding. Birding has become much more popular during the pandemic. It's seen a real big increase in participants, eBird, the database I mentioned, has seen a huge spike in use since the pandemic started, and it's because people are looking for ways to get outside and appreciate nature.
Roundabout Oxford was developed and produced by Brian Corrigan, Taylor Fields, Alan Munchauer, Abigail Norris, Christina Streeter, and Alex Watson. This episode was narrated by Taylor Fields and Gail Herrera. Thank you for listening to Roundabout Oxford.